I loved this show. I really did. In fact, I was so engrossed by the first and second seasons, I read all 3 of the books as soon as I could. I deeply enjoyed them and I was craving more from the world of the magicians. I recommended it to my friends, and while it had several issues, particularly the MTV and CW style romances, I could look past them to get to the story. I loved the idea of this world. Magic exists, it's highly exclusive, it's a discipline, but there's also things outside that discipline. There's an entire multiverse out there, and even different timelines. If you want details on the story so far, and why I liked it, I'll be making another video on that. But for now, let's talk about the current show. This is The Fall of the Magicians. I lost track of the series when I cut the cord, but I'd binge the seasons on Netflix whenever they'd come out. I was eagerly awaiting the 4th season, and then I started watching it. Immediately from the start, I felt something was different. The story felt lackluster, all our characters were scattered to the wind, and the pacing was just terrible. Each episode felt more like a compendium of each character's story, rather than one cohesive story. They completely changed the character of Margot without any real reason. She's mean, vile, foul-mouthed, and probably one of the most unlikable quote-unquote good characters I've ever seen on television. And when I say foul-mouthed, I want to be really clear about what I mean here. I don't mean dropping a few F-bombs. I mean very bizarre and strange profanity that is used to parody what a toxic male would sound like from the perspective of the writers. She has no charisma and exists purely to check a box. Still, I went on. I was confident that with the great groundwork the author had laid down, they couldn't stray too far. Unfortunately, I was wrong. And it all culminated in the episode The Side Effect. Penny, at least Penny from our timeline, is dead, and he's in the underworld. He's a supervisor and takes part in keeping people's books. Just a bit of background, in the Magician's universe, people's books are their life story. Everything someone has done, is doing, and will ever do has been cataloged and written in their book. Now, on with the scene.
Did I do something wrong?
I called you in to talk about Matilda Fremont. You shelved her book yesterday under disappointing prodigies?
Oh, right. Mastered the flute at 7, but became a mediocre poet. Unremarkable.
Did you read her brother's book? She saved his life, pulled him out of a self-destructive spiral, and he went on to become one of the world's greatest philanthropists. I wouldn't call that unremarkable.
Oh, okay. So is there a section for Sisters of Generous Men?
It's no coincidence this is a white male explaining how a woman should be classified as a disappointing prodigy. This isn't very subtle, but I've learned to expect it from modern television targeted at the key demographic. I mean, of course it's a white male saying this, and of course it's about a woman. Anyway, I just rolled my eyes and went on. As a bit of an aside though, it is very strange how Penny's counter-argument for why she's such a remarkable person is entirely due to her effect on a man and not her own accomplishments. But anyway, let's move on.
You've been in the underworld branch, 3 weeks? Yeah, when I died, all I cared about was getting back up there. And all this, yeah, I didn't think it mattered. Where a book goes, who reads it. Those books I lent you, you get a chance to read them?
Of course. Well, I skimmed.
How far'd you get?
Alice opened a pipe, accidentally helped blow up the Modesto branch, and Quentin played Pictionary with a mummy.
Where would you file them?
Quentin and Alice, star-crossed romances, probably. Or well-meaning failures.
What about the others?
Side characters and epic quests.
I'm a side character.
Oh, well, no offense. It's just Quentin's the center of the whole thing. He's the one that knows everybody. He's the one the little British girl picked to save the world.
Or he's the one that looks like you.
Alright, here we go. This is a flat-out BS argument. The first season follows Quentin, and yes, Julia to a certain extent. However, Quentin has always been the center of the story. This is true both in the books and in the show. It has absolutely nothing to do with how Quentin looks. So he's a depressed, skinny white guy. Whoop-de-doo. No one cares? What matters is the story and his relevance to the story. All this scene does is preach to the audience that if you're white, if you're a man, you've only been struck with the impression that Quentin is a main character because he quote-unquote looks like you. It also implies, rather insultingly, that the only people who could have thought that Quentin was the center of the story are white males. Now, the representation of the audience in this scene, the white guy in the chair, brings up a good point.
Not fair. Todd looks like me. He's not the center of shit.
But he could be.
No, he couldn't be, because he isn't and hasn't been the center of the story. For those of you who don't know, this is Todd, this is Quentin. The show is basically implying that the fit straight white guy who likes to party is exactly the same as a scrawny bisexual depressed guy with antisocial issues who mopes around most of the time. They are not the same. The writers are saying that it doesn't matter what kind of person you are, what your personality is, or whether you're the center of the story or not. The only thing that matters to these writers is the hue of your skin and what's between your legs.
All I'm saying is you think you've seen stories like this before, so you can guess what's going to happen, who's important and who isn't.
No, we haven't seen stories quite like this before. But Lev Grossman, the author of The Magicians, bucked a lot of fantasy conventions. Once again, though, it's not about guessing who is and isn't important. It is about the show and the books and what they tell us. We did not come into this story with Penny being the primary character, nor Elliot, nor Margot. If the story wanted these people to be the protagonists and the center of the story, then they should have set this up before. These are indeed side characters, but there's nothing wrong with being a side character. It has nothing to do with one's importance to the story. I've heard some counter-arguments saying that Quentin isn't the center of the story and never has been, that he's simply a narrative device, a way to introduce the audience to the world, and that he isn't necessary for the story to survive. In short, I simply don't agree. But to get a bit of perspective, I'm going to present a few examples of different types of stories, each that fits somewhere on the spectrum of whether the main character is or isn't the center of the story. Let's take a step back from The Magicians and look at a real protagonist-centered story. One that also involves a boy with magical powers, new to a world, going on adventures with a group of friends, each with their own stories intertwined with his. Harry is completely new to the magical world, much like Quentin. The story is told almost entirely from his point of view, and most of what happens outside Harry's presence is not shown to the viewer. To be fair to The Magicians, Harry Potter is a far more protagonist-centered story, but this is an example in a similar genre of a main character being new to the world, being a protagonist, and being the center of the story. While Hermione and Ron play a huge impact on the story and on Harry's life, they are still side characters. It doesn't mean they're unimportant. Ron plays wizard's chess to get Harry to the Sorcerer's Stone in the first movie. Is this unimportant? No, in fact it's essential. Anyway, let's look at another example, one where the main character is still largely the center of the story, but where things frequently split off. Now we have a main character, Frodo Baggins. We're introduced to the story in several characters. As we're acquainted with some of these characters, their stories branch out and take a unique spin. The quest to destroy the One Ring, however, begins and ends with Frodo. The story does not end when Aragorn is coronated as King of Gondor. The story does not end when Gimli and Legolas fade into the background. The story ends with Frodo taking Gandalf's hand and sailing to Valinor with the elves, leaving the mortal world behind. While each of the side characters, the members of the Fellowship and beyond, all play extremely important and critical roles in the story, the ultimate goal of the Fellowship is to destroy the One Ring. Every character in the story seeks a similar goal, to defeat Sauron. Everything they do is in service of that goal, even if their motivations are different. Yet despite all this, we would still say that Frodo is the protagonist. He is the center of the story. Without him, there is no story. While Frodo would have died without the aid of the Fellowship, and certainly without the aid of Samwise Gamgee he would have failed his quest, he's still the center of the story. We may enjoy the detours from his story more than our time with him, I know I certainly did, but that doesn't change the fact that he's the main character and he is the center of the story. Now that we've looked at stories where the protagonist is the center of the story, are there stories where a character is fall throughout the world, but they aren't really the center of the story? Sure. In fact, let's look at one. The very title of The Great Gatsby would seem to indicate to us that the center of the story isn't the person whose point of view we follow, Nick, but the Great Gatsby. In this case, the main character is a narrative device used to tell us a story of Gatsby. Nick is a new money man introduced to this old money lifestyle in the roaring 20s. Will we say that Nick isn't the main character, though? I don't think we would. While Gatsby is the focus of the film and Nick is essentially a narrative device, he's still the main character because we follow his point of view consistently throughout the story. He shares the spotlight with Gatsby, but that doesn't mean he isn't the protagonist. I don't know if I'd call Gatsby a side character necessarily, but he's very important to the story. One might even say he is a main character, but not the main character. Now let's bring this all back to The Magicians. On the spectrum of protagonist-centered stories, this is somewhere between The Lord of the Rings and The Great Gatsby. The past 3 seasons of The Magicians have been a story far more protagonist-centered, with nearly all the characters wanting a similar or primary goal or fighting a similar enemy. With this season, we take a hard turn, taking the focus off of Quentin to such an extent that he's hardly in the season at all. This is why the season meanders so much and is so off-kilter. They took a drastic course correction for apparently no reason. But, as we're about to find out, there is a reason. It just has nothing to do with the story. Let's continue with this scene.
But that's because you are trapped in your POV. You have a classic case of white male protagonism, Derek, and a librarian simply can't have that.
Oh, here we go. So, let's run down the list. You are wrong to think Harry Potter was a protagonist. If you thought he was, it's because you're a white male. You are wrong to think that Frodo was a protagonist, and if you thought that he was, it's because you're a white male. You're wrong to think that Quentin was a protagonist, and if you thought that he was, it's because you're fucking a white male! You see, it's not that the entirety of the books and the show, up to and including the past 3 seasons, have all ingrained in you the belief that Quentin is the main character. It's that you're a white male, stuck in your white male point of view. You are incapable of being a librarian in this story. Librarians curate knowledge, and how can you be objective? If you aren't white and aren't male, and still thought Quentin was the main character, well, But seriously, apply this logic to Harry Potter, The Lord of the Rings, The Great Gatsby, and it makes absolutely no sense. Quentin's race has absolutely nothing to do with whether he's the main character or not. It's what the story has led us to believe up to this point.
But that's why these books are so important. They're such a gift. They can allow you to see other points of view. And once you start seeing that, you'll find that the story doesn't end the way you think. And the most important characters aren't who you expect.
Ignoring all the woke BS, I want to latch onto that last quote.
And the most important characters aren't who you expect.
There's nothing wrong with this inherently. There are many stories where important characters are behind the scenes, hidden from view. Dumbledore in The Order of the Phoenix, The White Council in The Hobbit. Stories where the protagonists, like Nick from The Great Gatsby, are not the most important characters. This is a valid point, but to code it in racial language and preach to your audience is not only unnecessary, it alienates them. The rest of this episode is mediocre. We get more Margot being terrible, and somehow we're still supposed to like her, or think that this is an empowering representation. Being terrible to people isn't empowering. It's how you become hated. This ham-fisted character transformation is done entirely to wokeify the show even more, and as I said, it's a total, complete parody of what a quote-unquote toxic male is supposed to be, and the writers are so bad I can't tell if they mean it to be funny or unironic. I can also name you numerous examples where men are portrayed as weak, incompetent, and uncreative, and women, in contrast, are portrayed as resourceful, in positions of power, authority, and, in one case, is a literal goddess. I'm going to come back to this in a little bit, but let's jump to the end of the episode, where we have those writers trying to break down the fourth wall and really lecture us.
Seen enough?
To counteract a lifetime of cis-het frat bro bias? I doubt it.
Do I even need to explain what's wrong with this? It's pretty self-explanatory at this point. But please, writers, show us how woke you are.
Okay. So tell me, what was I supposed to take from that?
Zelda doesn't know it yet, but what she just set in motion is going to change the library forever. Same with Fen and Fillory, Katie, and all of magic. When you file people away as sidekicks, you don't realize their importance to the story, and this story belongs to a lot more people than you think. Where to shove a book? It's not a little thing. You're telling the world what to value, who to value. You get our responsibility here?
It's well said.
Penny actually brings up a good point here. If this wasn't covered in wokeness tripe, this would actually be an interesting idea and an interesting scene. I still have to disagree, though. A side character being a side character doesn't mean they aren't valued. I brought up the example of Ron and Hermione, but you could add a lot of characters to that list. Gandalf, Legolas, Gimli, Merry, Pippin, Samwise, Boromir, and Aragorn. Are these not important or not valued simply because they are side characters? No. Penny's premise is based entirely on the idea that because some characters in The Magicians are non-white and or women, that they must be the center of the story too. This is affirmed when they kill Quentin off at the end of the season. Yup, they kill off the main character. This isn't in the books, by the way. He also won't be coming back as an Underworld POV character or appearing in the story as Quentin from another timeline. He is the first permadeath in the main group of characters. They shoved them off the show to make room for side characters they felt were more important. I'd guess we have a Game of Thrones situation here. The book material was insufficient for what the writers wanted to do, so they took certain liberties and made it into whatever they wanted. Now, in the interest of total fairness, in an interview with The Hollywood Reporter, the writers said that, quote, Quentin came in with a very specific purpose and a very specific set of life goals and challenges. And in a way, I'm not sure what we would have done with the character had he lived, unquote. Apparently they called the author of the books, Lev Grossman, and he was on board with the decision. But something tells me we might either have a J.K. Rowling situation here, or that the writers are simply misrepresenting how the author reacted. Why do I think the author wasn't entirely on board? Well, let's listen to the writers describe it. Quote, we called Lev Grossman, author of the Magician's novels, and we said, we have this idea. What do you think about killing Quentin? It was a very long pause. And then he said he thought it was a really great and intriguing and rich idea. And he started pitching ideas for the other characters based on what would happen. So we realized we were onto something. Perhaps the author was truly enthusiastically on board. But it doesn't sound like from the language of the retelling that he was as thrilled with the idea as they want to claim. Speaking as a writer myself, if someone wanted to kill my main character off, my response would be something along the lines of, well, I guess you could do that. I guess it could work. But you'd have to change the trajectory of the entire story and all the other characters significantly to make it work. In my personal opinion, the writers are just looking to get an affirmative from the author without modifying any of the other characters, just so that they could say they consulted with the author in interviews like this one. Now I hear you dear viewers say, well, it seems they killed Quentin off to aid in the story, to conclude his arc. Despite not being in the books at all, it seems like a good idea. And to you, dear viewer, I want to direct you back to this article from The Hollywood Reporter. Not only do the writers describe how character deaths before haven't involved the actors exiting the project, but coming back in another form, as in the case of Penny, they also describe their other motivations for getting rid of him. I just really don't buy that there was no possible route for them to take this character, or that they had no ideas. How about recovering from depression? How about recovering from the tons of PTSD he probably has gone through? How about sorting things out with his romantic interest Alice, who he just recently started things up with again? I'm not a television writer, but even I can come up with at least a season or two of ideas for this character to develop. I think the real reason they killed him off was because, as the scene we're reviewing shows, he's a white male. At this point, dear viewer, I can only imagine you're saying, oh, come on, that seems like a bit of a jump to take without evidence. Well, let's look back at this gem of an article. The interviewer asks, quote, Episode 7 of the season, The Side Effect, explicitly challenges the idea that a fantasy story needs a white male protagonist. Was that moment part of the build-up to Quentin leaving the show? Unquote. One of the writers responds immediately with, quote, yes, that was a huge part of the conversation for us, unquote. And another writer adds in, quote, and from a dramaturgical point of view, it's kind of great that at last the white male lead on a show is no longer safe, unquote. Right. It's not like Game of Thrones showed white males dying that were central to the plot on a nearly seasonal basis. It's not like The Lord of the Rings showed Boromir die in the first movie. It's not like Harry Potter showed Cedric Diggory die, have Harry in danger in every single movie, and actually kill him at the end. It's a ridiculous notion that white males have ever been safe in fantasy stories, and despite what else the writers may say, that seems to be the primary reason they wanted to kill Quentin off. Otherwise, they wouldn't have spent an entire episode lecturing the audience about how they must be white males for not being okay with the decision to not only sideline Quentin, but to kill him off. Though, I'm sure that this well-thought-out decision will definitely pay off in the ratings. Oh, it's also quite interesting that while the whole point of this episode is to challenge the belief that Quentin isn't the main character and that all these side characters matter just as much, if not more, when they do actually kill Quentin off, he dies by literally sacrificing himself to save the entire universe. But you're still a white male if you think he's the protagonist in the center of the story. I want to also take a moment and look at some of the older fantasy stories. Fantasy stories aren't new. The legend of King Arthur, for example, has been told and retold for centuries, and in nearly every interpretation he dies at the end. A lot of fantasy stories come from European myth and legends. How can every fantasy story have main characters be safe? The short answer is that they can't. It's so frustrating as a historian and as a writer to see these distortions of history and of the fantasy genre. Anyway, we are not done yet, ladies and gentlemen. Nope, not yet. We are back to Penny and the white cis het frat bro for one last dose of wokeness.
I think you've earned the right to move up.
Excuse me?
I know so much about you and your friends, but you never asked me how I died.
Okay, how did you die?
Arrow to the chest during the Crusades.
The Crusades? 1,000 years ago?
We really thought the story was all about white guys back then, believe me.
Oh God. As a historian, I cannot tell you how wrong this is. Furthermore, there were plenty of Christians who were not white. In fact, the entire region was Christian and non-white until the Muslim conquest. Even after the Muslim conquest, Christians in Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia, remained. The Crusades were in no way about the story of white people being right. The Crusades were a series of wars fought to stave off encroaching caliphates. In the West, the Moors had actually conquered much of modern-day Spain and Portugal, and were so bold as to attack France. France! The whole reason the First Crusade was called in the beginning was because the Seljuk Turks were about to lay siege to Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, as well as to reestablish the borders of the Christian kingdoms that were conquered previously. Sorry for the history lesson. I just hope that this illustrates just how badly these writers absolutely have no idea what they're talking about. We should just synthesize their whole philosophy of storytelling and history into white man bad.
And I'm not new at all. I'm actually your supervisor's supervisor.
So, you're my boss?
I fully see the irony of a white guy giving you this test, but ladies upstairs love a twist, so they always send me.
Send you to what?
To promote you. You're clearly ready for the next level.
Which is?
Secrets taken to the grave. You're gonna collect them. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Oh, and I'm afraid we're gonna need you to start right away.
Did you notice that? Let's replay it.
I fully see the irony of a white guy giving you this test, but ladies upstairs love a twist, so they always send me.
Send you to what?
To promote you.
Of course we can't have a white guy in a position of ultimate authority. No, no, no. We must have it be the ladies upstairs giving the orders. The only time this white guy has any authority is when he's sent by the ladies to promote someone who is non-white. Alright, we're done with this scene and done with this episode. Thank God. I have to be honest with you though, I had to stop after this. I was so baffled by how bad and on the nose this was, I just had to take a step away. Eventually I found the wherewithal to watch the next episode. I hoped it would get better, but it just didn't. It got worse and worse until the end, and contrary to what the writers claim my white male POV imprisons me into believing, I do know how this story ends. This isn't all the issues that Season 4 has. It's unfunny despite constant pop culture references, and attempts to make you laugh just fall flat. Killing white men and infecting them with lycanthropy, werewolf virus spread through the hanky-panky if you know what I mean, is played for gaffes and jokes because, what's funnier than white men dying and being ripped to shreds, right? In one plotline, Margot finds out that there's these spirits in the desert that possess women if they're too emotional. Initially, they're treated as evil, but we find out that later they're actually kind spirits of women who've been wronged and that they possess men and do women's bidding. It's just so on the nose with everything. The big baddie also ends up being a white male. We get it, writers. You hate white men. You don't want white men to watch your show. That's okay. I've received the message loud and clear. You couldn't pay me to watch Season 5. It's almost like killing off the main character, the protagonist, the center of your story, simply because he had the wrong skin color and the wrong gender, has killed the story too. This show has morphed into a complete and total mess. It's not just the ham-fisted wokeness there's steam pumping down your throat, it's also the storytelling. It's uninteresting, the characters are bland, everything is so rushed, and the forced romances are just terrible. This used to be a good show, but it succumbed to its woke fate. The last season has record low ratings, and with each episode, they're only getting lower. As of now, no Season 6 has been announced, and considering how far they are into Season 5, that's not a good sign. Unfortunately, the show is long past its due date. It's just time to go back to the books, to what The Magicians is really about. The books aren't flawless either, but this show might as well be a ripoff with the same names, because at this point, that's all it is. A hollow ripoff. Well, everyone, that was my take on the fall of the Magicians. I emphasize a lot of the wokeness here because it was particularly egregious, but if you've enjoyed the show up to this point, I'm sure you can see the other points of deterioration. I'd love to hear what you guys think, so please like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.